Welcome and good evening. My name is Corinne DeBray, and I'm Managing Director of the Foster. And on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to welcome and thank you for your coming to this month's talk, part of our My Journey with Tony Foster speaker series. Tony Foster's watercolor paintings are grouped into journeys that explore a chosen theme, and we're fortunate to have 2 complete journeys on display at the Foster, exploring beauty and sacred places, as well as selected paintings from previous journeys. This evening, I'm excited to introduce Mattias Lanas, who will be sharing his journey with Tony and their travels in the Atacama Desert and in northern Chile. So I'd like to introduce Mattias. Please give him a warm welcome.
So I just want to start off by saying how grateful I feel to be able to present to you guys about this trip. I got a chance to reminisce about my time traveling with Tony in the north of Chile, which was almost 2 years ago now, or maybe 3 years ago. And it's really neat just thinking about the context of what this place has become and what my first experience was, as I'm about to tell you. So in fall of 2015, I was finishing up a graduate program in Monterey, doing scientific illustration and merging 2 of my passions, which is art and the natural world. And I finished up that program and then quickly got swept up in this very exciting project called the Foster, that was just beginning. The building hadn't yet been constructed, and I think we were all trying to figure out what this is going to be. And so I got to be a part of that. My first job as the program assistant at the Foster was to go with Tony Foster, to the north of Chile. And to document the artists, take photos, take video clips, and gather media that we could then use in the exhibitions in the surrounding area that you see here. And so I kind of got a very steep learning curve. I got to know the artists very quickly, and I got to quickly understand what this place was becoming. In addition to that, I was in charge of planning logistics for this trip, which was kind of sprung upon me, and I took on with gusto. My family's from Chile originally, so I felt like it was appropriate for me to be able to do that. However, this trip was based in the north, which is very different than the capital, Santiago. The north is very special, and I'll talk about why it is so. So yeah, that was my introduction to the Foster and to Tony. Let me now introduce who our team was traveling on this trip. So Tony Foster generally travels with a bunch of individuals. Most of them are folks that he knows well and that he can trust and he can rely upon. This was a very unusual case in that Tony didn't really know any of us. Charlie Udding is the first one. He's the young guy in the lower left. Charlie is, I believe, the nephew of one of Tony's gallery owners. And he was 23 at the time. He was very excited to be an artist one day and was gearing up to go to art school, and decided that he wanted to travel with an artist and see if he could build up some work that way and build up some experience. So Charlie actually did some crowdfunding, and we all helped him and pitched in so that he could come on this trip with us. Tony only knew about Charlie because of this connection, being the nephew of one of his art world friends. Dave is the guy pictured all the way on the right. Dave is Tony's friend from the pub in Cornwall, England. And Dave was fantastic. He was such an asset on the trip because he provided all of the humor and all the lightheartedness that kept us through very tense moments. But so Dave and Tony had been friends for a long time. Dave had never traveled with Tony. He's a retired policeman from the little tiny town in Cornwall where they live, and decided to embark on this huge trip to Chile. So. And then there was me joining the trip as a representative of the foundation. And I think Tony felt a little bit of unease just not knowing who I was and potentially thinking, oh, the foundation's sending someone to watch me and sort of, see what I'm doing. So there was a little bit of navigating that tension in the beginning, but very quickly I learned that he was a very charismatic, friendly individual, and we got along just fine. So the 4 of us, we're a pretty eclectic group just traveling in the north of Chile. So, our mission. We were to document 2 broad locations in the north of Chile as part of Exploring Beauty, which is the exhibition just to my left in there. That, just to recap, that journey was based off of nominations from experts, scientists and explorers in the field. And so we have 2 experts who nominated areas in this part of the world. The first one is Sir Stephen Sparks, who's a volcanologist from the University of Bristol. And Stephen Sparks nominated Parinacota volcano as the most beautiful volcano in the world. And I'll show you in a little bit where that's located. The second nomination came after the fact, and this was by a woman named Maria Teresa Ruiz, and she's an astronomer, a well-known astronomer from Santiago in Chile. And she nominated the Atacama Desert broadly, but specifically focusing on the night skies, which are, for her, the most beautiful night skies in the world. And that has to do because of some aspects of the desert itself. So we were going to Chile to document these 2 places and have Tony create paintings for his Exploring Beauty series. So, for those that don't know, Chile is the long, skinny country all the way on the western coast of South America. It's almost as long as the width of the United States, just for context. And Santiago is the star right in the middle, so that's where we first landed when Tony, Charlie, and I arrived there. Dave was meeting us separately. The Atacama Desert is the region all the way up in the north of the country. It actually extends further into Peru and into Bolivia as well. But the Atacama is the driest non-polar desert in the world, and the polar regions are considered deserts sometimes because there's not actually precipitation in those areas. But as far as traditional deserts, this is the driest desert in the world. And in some parts, there's been no recorded rainfall to date. So, Parinacota volcano is all the way at the very north of the country. It's actually on the border with Bolivia, and the volcano is split between both countries. And so our destination was somewhere there in the north, and then we were going to do a road trip. Because this was an extensive area, we had to think creatively about how we were going to cover ground. Normally Tony's traveling by foot, or if it's on the coast, he's kayaking. But in this case, we had to traverse a lot of terrain, and so we had to think about how we were going to do that. Just a little more context. Parinacota is an Aymara word. The Aymara people that live in this part of the world and up in Bolivia as well. Parinacota means flamingo lagoon, and I'll explain why that is. And then the lagoon itself that we will show in this part of the world is named Chungara, and Chungara means rocks covered with moss. And again, you'll see why that is the case. So all this is a very high elevation volcano. It's up at 1,500 feet just at the base. And then scaling the volcanoes even further. I'll get more into that in a little bit. All right, so we arrived in Santiago. We started traveling north. We took another plane to a town called Calama. Calama is a very important mining town in the north of Chile, and mining is one of the biggest industries in this part of the world, both for copper and lithium extraction from the salt pans up there. And so when we arrived, it was like minor city. All the trucks were red, and actually our rental turned out to be one of the mining trucks. Everyone was wearing hard hats, like it was very much a present part of the town. But this is flying over some of the desert, and you can see in these areas, these are actually some of the salt pans, the salares that are in the north. So I'm going to zoom into this particular area right here because this is what's relevant to our trip, and this, just for reference, is this square up here. So I'll continue to reference this map and orient you guys as we go through this. So as I said, we covered a really broad area during this trip, which ended up being about 3 weeks long. And just for a little bit more orientation, Chile has an average width of about 109 miles. So I think the widest part is right here, but on average it's about 109 miles. And of course it's very long. So our trip begins at Calama. This is where we first landed, and then immediately after getting supplies and things, we traveled south and over to this area. So this is us gathering supplies in Calama. It's a very industrial town, lots of supermarkets, and we weren't sure what to expect initially, but we ended up finding everything we needed. Fuel canisters for our stoves, tarps to cover all our gear in the back of our truck, etc. The most important assets for us and the biggest sources of anxiety were how do we get water and how do we get gas along this route. because most of it, as you'll see, is just wide desert, wide open desert. And it was hard to tell what the towns contained. Even some of the bigger names on the map we later found out were either uninhabited derelict buildings, or they just had small populations and no gas or very little access to water. So, and then this is a photo traveling down towards San Pedro, as I pointed out earlier, just to give you a sense of what the landscape is. It can, in one view, it could be very bleak. It's also very serene and beautiful. There's no plants whatsoever. It's almost like what I can imagine being on Mars is like. So we were itching to get out of Calama just because we wanted to get out into the desert landscape, and so we took off towards San Pedro. We drove into San Pedro. We had a general sense of what we wanted to do on this trip, but a lot of the way that Tony works and operates is he travels around and will do this with his hands. And eventually he finds a painting in the landscape, and that's where we decide to settle and camp. And he'll sit and paint for a while. So we were in this very popular tourist town called San Pedro for a while, getting oriented, getting acquainted with where we would go. Eventually we decided to pursue some geysers that we heard were very interesting to go visit. And so we started on this route to go see the geysers, which were higher up in elevation towards the east of the country. We stopped for the night at this spot over here, and we came across wild vicuñas, which I'll show you pictures of later. And it was just beautiful, just a really, really enchanting landscape. So this was the first place where we spent the night. The next morning was cold, and it had snowed overnight, and everything had changed. And so we woke up freezing with rain and then snow covering our tents. But we decided, to get up and continue going towards the geysers. The name of these geysers is El Tatio. And when we arrived, there was no one there. It was pretty bleak, and of course it was freezing. And so this is us huddled in our rain gear in front of one of the geysers. And I think Tony's worked in Yellowstone before, and if anyone's been to Yellowstone National Park, the geysers are spectacular there. In comparison, what we saw here was pretty bleak, not just because of the weather, but just the infrastructure as well is not set up to support mass tourism. We later learned that someone had actually passed away because they essentially cracked into a shell of an open pool, and it's all these kinds of accidents are happening. So we felt pretty lucky after that, but this is a sense of what we saw. Nothing spectacular like Old Faithful. And I think at this point Tony was feeling concerned. He wasn't sure if he was going to find something that was suitable for paintings. So instead of continuing up along the Andes, we decided to cut back, go down to the lowlands. And this is the site we encountered as soon as we got down from the snow. Beautiful, just expansive tufts of grass, alpine grasses. This is where Tony found a painting, and so he's stopping and assessing the landscape in there. So back to orientation. We started in Calama. We came all the way down to San Pedro up here, and then we took this little visited road all the way up to the geysers, and then decided, nope, we're not going to keep going north. This is too cold. The weather looks like it might be snowing, and so we started doubling back this way, and this is now where we are. This is where Tony created the first of his paintings. It's one of the ones in Exploring Beauty, and you can see clearly in the landscape where this is. Tony looks for diagonals in the landscape and different layering, so you have foreground, middle ground, and background to draw your eye into the distance, and so for him, this is the focus. Of course, it snowed again that night, and it was so cold, and I remember just being up most of the night trying to find a different position, to sleep in. I had a sub-zero sleeping bag, but still. And this is Tony in the morning, a little bit grumpy, getting out of his. So I think part of our role, as he affectionately calls the people that travel with him his Sherpas, part of our role was to just continue to motivate him and provide him with, optimism, because sometimes it can be challenging like this, and you start wondering or questioning, why am I out here? Especially in Tony's case, he says, I could be home with my wife, I could be having tea in front of my fire, why am I doing this again? Yes. Thank you. So the question was, what time of year is this? This is in fall of 2015, so this was October, and then we went into November a little bit.
So that's spring, not fall.
I'm sorry, you're right. Our fall, their spring. Yeah. All right, so we got further down into the lowlands. This is an example of the typical lunch. And this is a non-traditional Foster lunch because, again, we're tailgating. This whole trip is based out of a car, whereas normally he's trekking with a backpack or kayaking or paddling. And so this was pretty nice that we were able to carry our food this way. We had a giant jug of water as an emergency just in there. So back to orientation once more. We're heading back towards Calama now, and we've decided we're going to hit Calama and go over to the coast, and from there start heading north to get to our ultimate destination, which is this volcano, rather than taking the Andean route just because the weather looked like it was stormy. So this is us getting to the coast, and that was a surprise as well. We expected with more moisture next to the water, potentially there might be more plants, but no, it's just sand and rock all the way to the ocean. So this is the town of Tocopilla. It was an important fishing town and port at one time, and now it's still a fishing town, but there's not a huge source of income in terms of the port anymore. So we were able to get showers here, which we're so thankful for, and sleep in real beds for one night. And then we continued going up the coast. This is one of the spots that we stopped up. The highway basically, if you look at the map, it runs right along the coast. And it's fairly unsightly, but you can find these divots of beauty in amongst that. And especially in this kind of mysterious gray landscape, Tony was able to pick out some particularly poignant landscapes. While we were here, we saw local fishermen pulling algae out of the water, and they'll actually dry this kelp and then sell it abroad. And then Tony also noticed that there were divers diving for urchins, and so that features into his work right here as a souvenir. But this is the next painting that Tony created on our trip. And this is him doing that work. And you can see the scene looks a little bit bleak, and he's managed to transform it a bit. That's pretty typical of his work, is that it's sort of an idealized state of what that wilderness looks like. So, Tocopilla, we're somewhere in here now. We're continuing to migrate up the coast. The next big city is called Iquique. It's a very big, important city, and so all the way along here, we're seeing what we can find. This next spot was, again, next to the highway. What you don't see in these pictures is the trash that was unfortunately littering the beaches, and it was next to the highway. So that made me realize that, sometimes the areas where you find wilderness, it's a particular view of wilderness, and you're sort of isolating a spot. And sadly, it speaks to the state of affairs in our world. But I think Tony's trying to highlight, what little wilderness remains. These are the crabs here that feature in this next work. And you can see, again, kind of the bleak landscape that's been transformed into this idealized state. But yeah, what was really neat about this spot is that we stopped and we camped on the beach. And even though there was trash in the surroundings, we saw a cormorant come in and fish, and it grabbed a fish way bigger than we thought it could swallow. And the poor bird had to work overtime, eventually got the fish down its gullet, and then it couldn't take off. So it was just moments like that where all of us just sat eating our dinner watching this happen, sort of as if we were on Discovery Channel, and felt very fortunate to have that experience together. All right, so we're heading towards Iquique. We're somewhere here now. The other major source of economy in this area is guano extraction. And this is just from millennia of birds depositing guano along the coast, pooping on the coast. And so this is what they would use for fertilizer, for saltpeter. And now it's not as much of an industry, but we still saw evidence of that. This is in Iquique. Going up the cliff after the city, we decided we don't want another big city. And the traffic was terrible. Basically, Iquique is right on the coast, on a beach, and then there's a cliff right behind it. So you have to go up that cliff to get back to the main road, and this is us doing that. We wanted to get back out into the desert. So we were back out into the flat, kind of Mars-like landscape, and then suddenly, as we're driving, we come across this oasis full of trees, and the whole area is it's made up of salt, so it has this thick crust of salt, very unusual, and somehow these trees are living in there. And later we found out these are a special kind of tree, very salt tolerant and that grow in the desert. It's one of the only things that can grow there. And because of that, it harbors all kinds of life, like this beautiful scorpion that we found. But yeah, these trees are called tamarugal, and this is one of Chile's parks, national parks. But we decided to camp out there while Tony was working on his other paintings. I wanted to show this as just an example of the archaeology and just the rich history of this area. Because there's not much erosion, there's almost no precipitation, anything that's done to the landscape pretty much remains in perpetuity. And so this is one of the many geoglyphs that we saw. Geoglyph meaning artwork that's sort of made by moving rocks on the landscape, as opposed to a petroglyph, which is carved. You can see a bust there for scale. I mean, this thing is huge. But yeah, these things are just throughout the desert. You see them as you're traveling.
So what year would that have been made?
That's a great question. I'm guessing BC, but I don't know. I don't know when. Yeah.
BCE?
We had to cross this canyon. You can see how lush the canyons are, and they support agriculture. But this is the area where a group known as the Chinchorro culture was living for a long time. And some of the oldest mummies in South America are found in this area, again, because of the preservation that the desert confers on them. So yeah, this area was just very rich with history, and of course we couldn't sample everything, but we got little tastes as we went. So after this, we kept moving north. We started heading back into the Altiplano, crossing over again because the volcano was located on the other side of the country. And we passed a lot of these little towns. As we got further up into the highlands, more vegetation. It was my birthday, and so we had a very meager, I think it was a dehydrated blueberry strudel or something that we rehydrated very poorly and lit a little leaf on fire and had a nice celebration. But that was a very special birthday for me, just again being out there. So again, we came up from Iquique, we crossed over, came over here, found that oasis, and then we continued taking this road and finally crossing over back towards the volcano. And here we just found all kinds of little towns scattered throughout wilderness, essentially. We didn't know what we were going to find. So our destination was this place called Putre, which is it's an old city, an Aymara city or town. And that was at the base of the national park that contains the volcano. So this is our arrival in Putre, and you get a sense of, I mean, again, it was a town, but this one's located so high up. Putre is at 11,000 feet, and that's just the town. We went even higher after that. But lots of farming and agriculture in the surrounding area, lots of ancient traditions that are still kept up to this day, and then lots of livestock as well. And so the place where we camped, every morning and every night, we'd have the sheep and the goats come by, which is a nice treat. We also got to do a little bit of exploring in this area, and actually went out to see some petroglyphs and rock art that was in the area. So this is the next painting that Tony created. This is the one called A Stream in the Desert. And again, we were just walking on this hike. Tony was mapping out the landscape with his hands and said, oh, there's a painting. And so he plopped down, he started getting to work, and the rest of us, Dave, Charlie, and I continued, did some exploring just to see what we could find. We found that we weren't very good at identifying painting sites for Tony. There would always be something incorrect with the landscape, but eventually we got a little better at it. But this just demonstrates the dramatic landscape we were in terms of the valleys and canyons formed here, and then agriculture happening anywhere that there is flat land. And unfortunately, some of this rock art you can see was just desecrated over the ages. Yeah?
When you stopped like that for him to paint, about how long did you stay there? Was that an hour? Is it a day?
Yeah, so let me repeat the question. He asked if when we stop like that to paint, if we're staying for an hour or for a day. And so in this case, we were out the whole afternoon. Later, you'll see we actually left Tony by himself for a couple days and just would check in. But yeah, it varies on the painting. In this case, we had our agenda still to go to the volcano, so he knew we only had one night. All right, so we're in Putre. We did some exploring over here, and now we're about to go over to the park. So we finally found the volcano. There's a town at the base of the volcano with the same name, Parinacota. And you can see here from the Chilean side that you have this beautiful lake, high alpine lake. This is now at 15,000 feet elevation, and again, just at the base. But this volcano just juts out of the landscape, and it's very majestic. It's like Mount Fuji. So we got there, and there was nice lighting. We were looking for painting spots, and then boom, hailstorm comes through out of nowhere. And so we backed down and hunkered down in the town, Parinacota, up at 15,000 feet. This is Tony and Dave doing some exploration around the area. Where we decided to camp was wonderful because in the distance you could see the peak of Parinacota poking out from behind the ridge, and at night that would get lit up by moonlight and sort of glow. The peak behind it is actually a mountain that Tony had painted many years before from the Bolivian side. And I think at the time he didn't realize that he was painting the same mountain, but he recognized it from this side and said, oh, I've been there from the other side. And so you'll notice in Beauty, one of the paintings that's there is actually a 1998 painting that he decided to add in just as a contrast with this current painting. So, yeah, this was definitely one of the most stunning views that we saw. Eventually, Tony, we went back out to the site where you could observe the volcano from across the lake, and we had the hardest time finding painting locations. This is another situation where the highway was going right around the border of the lake, and so unfortunately that meant we had a lot of pollution around. It also meant there wasn't really a safe spot to kind of pull over and camp. Tony ended up finding a little finger of land that extended into the lake. It jutted out over a dune, and he plopped down there and just set up his tent. The rest of us would go down to the main town where that initial camping spot was here. And then we'd visit him for lunch every day pretty much, and then just before the end of the day to make sure he was okay, to have lunch with him, make sure he had enough supplies. But at that point he needed to work alone and needed time to himself. Tony was planning on spending maybe 5 days working on this painting. This was the large format one. And here's progress shots of him working. It ended up 3 days. He was just too miserable. And again, it had to do with the conditions, being scorching temperatures during the day, suddenly being hit by hailstorms. At night, his entire water jug freezing solid, and him not being able to have tea in the morning. So yeah, it was quite the adventure. But you can see in the souvenirs he's included allusions to the flamingos that reside, the Andean flamingos that reside in this lake. Flamingos, yeah, Andean flamingos. And we saw flamingos, yeah, and in fact I'll show you a picture next of some of the wildlife that we were encountering, and this is my favorite part. So on the left we have a creature called a vizcacha, which is somewhat related to a chinchilla. A lot of people know chinchillas. Andean coots are these gigantic birds living up in high elevation in the Altiplano. Here's the Andean flamingos that we were able to see. We have alpacas that people were raising, tinamous and all kinds of unusual birds, wild vicuñas, and then of course lots of cactus and in bloom as well. And this is where I want to tell you a story. So there's a bird in the very north of Chile that's related to ostriches. It's called a rhea. And so rheas are this group that's found in South America. And we were really hoping that we would see one. Tony had seen them before in Bolivia and was hoping that he might encounter one here. So we decided, we had 1 bar of chocolate, and we said, the first person who spots a rhea, whether it's in the distance or right next to us, gets the entire bar of chocolate. And that was a huge treasure for us because we were sugar deprived at that point. And so we, as we were driving along, all of us were just quiet, intently looking out into the distance. Eventually, Tony put some music on and we started chatting. And then next thing I know, Tony's pointing out, said, there's one. He just goes, there's one. And so sure enough, right in front of us was this beautiful rhea. And it started moving away, and then all these little babies came out and started following it. And so everyone was just jumping for joy. And Tony was jumping for joy. It's a big bar of chocolate. So, luckily he shared with us, but yeah, that was definitely a highlight. All right, so we're continuing south at this point. We've gone past the volcano. We're making our trajectory back towards San Pedro, but this time along the Andes rather than on the coast. Passing a lot of these salt pans. This one's a borax salt pan, and so there was actually a whole industry with trucks extracting borax for shipping around the world. We had some harrowing experiences not being able to, one, find gas, and then not being able to find lodging for the night. And so we kept driving. Eventually we ended up at this border town with Bolivia that looked like something out of a Western. It was just a strip. And you know, we felt a little uneasy being there, but we found this hotel. Then it was Dave's birthday, and so we put a candle into a Reese's cup and, you know, gave him a little treat. We tried to then pass over, we had to go over an overpass to get to our next destination. That was a pretty high elevation. And Charlie, the young athletic Charlie, succumbed to altitude sickness, and it became pretty serious pretty quick. And since he was our driver, and I can't drive stick, you know, we were in a bit of a pinch. So it was Dave driving us through this overpass. Eventually we made it down lower elevation, and Charlie quickly recovered. But this was serious for Tony because Tony had once suffered from altitude sickness when he was painting in Nepal and nearly died during that experience. And so this was a very serious matter for him and not something we took lightly. Eventually we found our way back to the main highway. We survived. So we came down from Parinacota, followed this dirt road all the way down here, stayed at the border town, and then were able to cross back over. Found a little oasis in the middle of the dunes in this town called Pica. You never know what you're going to get because you see names on a map, but you have no idea if it's a giant town or, you know, what kind of infrastructure it has. Luckily, we were able to buy bread and supplies here, and then we connected with the main route and came all the way back towards Calama. We didn't stop in Calama. We went all the way down towards San Pedro. So this is our next spot. This is the touristy destination that people visit in San Pedro. It's called Valle de la Luna, which translates to Valley of the Moon, just again because of the unearthly landscapes. And this is a huge ridge of salt formations and rock that's just been chiseled out over the eons, but again, not too much precipitation. So Tony was against going here at first because he tends to avoid the touristy locations. We finally convinced him to make it. We had to pay a park entrance fee, which was such a burden at first, but you know, it was well worth it because the views were spectacular, and you can see here Tony's doing his thing, trying to find a painting in the landscape, which he very quickly found. And in the meantime, while he was painting, Charlie, Dave, and I would go around and explore the area. So this is the next painting that Tony produced at Valle de la Luna. It's looking into the distance at a Bolivian volcano called Lincolnshire. It's this one here. And this is Tony working in scorching heat, sometimes over 100 degrees just during the day, sitting there doing his painting. So this is more of the surrounding landscape, just again to show how unearthly it is and wonderful. Tony was working on that previous painting for about a day, and then we decided, Charlie, Dave, and I, to scale up this ridge, and we just found this spectacular view. We said, this has to be something that Tony sees. Even though we hadn't been very lucky before in finding painting sites for Tony, there was always something wrong with them. This one we were certain was going to be fantastic. And so at the end of the day, just as the park was closing, we forced Tony to hike up this huge ridge, and he was not happy. But he made it to the top, and he said, well, this looks great, this looks fine, you know, but we could tell he wasn't enthused. We turned him around, and you could see this huge, wonderful Stegosaurus-like, you know, rock formation into the distance, and he was blown away, and he decided, you know, we were only going to spend one day in Valle de la Luna. He decided to do another painting there, which is this one here. Just such an unusual landscape, and then again the same volcano in the distance. So because we had to pay an entrance fee each time we came in, Tony worked with the ranger, and essentially they allowed him to come in to just go and do that one painting site. We would drop him off, and then we would go and do other things. But here he is showing the ranger, you know, the progress on the painting each day. And then this is him working on site again in 100-degree plus weather during the day. And he was pretty jealous because at that point, Dave, Charlie, and I found some natural springs and went swimming. So we came back all refreshed, and poor Tony had been working out all day in the sun. All right, so San Pedro, we eventually finished up here, and our trip was over. And one of the luminaries, Maria Teresa Ruiz, the astronomer, had very kindly arranged for a tour of Alma, which is down here. And so we had a very specific day when we had to do that. We decided, to call it quits on Valle de la Luna, and then we headed over to Alma. I'll tell you a little bit about Alma because it was a very special experience. So Alma is the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. It's the largest astronomical project in existence. Unlike using light telescopes that are gathering starlight, this one actually uses satellite dishes and gathers infrared radiation. But it's 66 of these dishes that are set at very high elevation, and they're collecting information about the universe and making discoveries. And this was so interesting to me and exciting for Tony because it's foundational science. It's science for the purpose of science. And the other thing that's great about ALMA is it's an international collaboration. So the Chilean government sponsors a lot of it, but they also work with the European Southern Observatory, ESO, the U.S. National Science Foundation, NSF, the National Institutes of Natural Sciences, NINS of Japan, the NRC in Canada, the NSC and ASIAA in Taiwan, and KASI, the Republic of Korea. So all these are collaborating, and they're sharing the resource of ALMA to get their projects.
Also in Spanish and Italian, and I think Latin means soul.
Yeah.
Alma.
So to repeat, yeah, alma means soul in Spanish. So yeah, no, it was a fantastic experience. And I wasn't sure how Tony was going to respond because here's all this technology being set out in this desolate, beautiful wilderness. But he loved it. I think again he was inspired by the science that was being done here. And so we got a tour of the facility, and you saw Tony wearing his hard hat. We saw the machines that were moving these satellites and learned about the different discoveries that were made, a lot of them to do these days with dark matter. And then eventually the tour finished, and the tour guide said, "Those who are here for the special tour, come with me." And we sort of stepped aside, and they grabbed us and they took us all the way to Chaknantor Plateau, which is kind of off limits, and this is where the satellite dishes are located. So this is, we got a special treatment essentially and got bussed up to this location not many people get to go to. And it was freezing. This is Tony here with his parka on, hood on. The wind is howling, but the Chaknantor Plateau is great, is an ideal location for this because the Atacama is so dry, you don't have humidity in the air preventing radiation from getting through, and it's also high up, so there's less atmosphere up there. So it's an ideal spot for this kind of work. And that's why a lot of observatories are set up in the Atacama. So this is the last painting that Tony created. He actually did this one at home, and he did it from a photograph, which is very unlike his other work. But the reason is that he felt he needed to pay tribute to Maria Teresa Ruiz, who specifically pointed out the night sky of the Atacama. And he'd never worked at night. He didn't know how he was going to do that, so he ended up using a photograph. But I believe he put all the stars, or at least the major stars, correctly where they should go for the southern sky because he was working from that photograph. And these cacti are really interesting. They're Atacama endemic. They look sort of like saguaros, but they only occur in this part of the world. And lastly, he stuck a meteorite in there that a friend had given him as a part of completing this work. So here's the cactuses just for scale. These incredible structures just coming out of the driest desert in the world. And this is me for scale. And so this concluded our trip. We then headed back to Calama and did a celebratory real dinner, non-dehydrated food, which was well appreciated. And I have a couple takeaways from that trip that I wanted to share with you. Definitely a lot of just interesting experiences working with someone who's decided to dedicate their life to being an artist explorer. You don't meet many people doing that these days. But the biggest some of the biggest ones are the following. The first is traveling with Tony. The plans are always in flux. I'd put together this beautiful itinerary that I thought was very well laid out. As soon as we spotted a painting, we were derailed for a day, and so by a day in, we had changed plans. And that was okay. I quickly learned to let go and understood that a lot of the process is it's organic. Tony has a large amount, an infinite amount of stories to tell, and we had all kinds of interesting car conversations. And Tony's actually going to be here in April, so if you guys are able to come back, I highly recommend you pick his brain a little bit. This also just gave me an understanding of how much of an effort goes into these paintings. It's all of the logistics, all of the travel, all of the hardships. That's the stuff that you don't see necessarily in the finished piece. But the more you dig into the context of the work, like the more you understand really why they're such powerful pieces and why they mean so much to the artist. And this quote I thought was funny and just very dry, sort of Tony humor. But I was asking him about how he gets inspired and what's so exciting about his work. And of course he says, with watercolor painting, you're always on the edge of catastrophe. And that was his sort of mantra as we were heading up towards Lauca and the volcano. But to me, that was it sort of symbolized the way that Tony approaches his work sometimes. It's sort of from this pessimistic angle. But eventually, once the painting is done and once he's able to look back on the experience, he cherishes every moment. So I'll leave you with a picture of our team and one of the hostel owners who became a good friend, Umberto, in San Pedro. But yeah, this was our trip. Thank you.